Blood and power. These were the twin stars that guided Henry VIII's tempestuous reign, as his diseased form lay besieged by illness in the winter of 1547. England's most formidable king confronted mortality with the same iron will that had condemned two queens and countless souls. "The lion is brought low," whispered hushed voices in the corridors, but beware, his roar can still shake the kingdom. The path to this tragic end began with a golden prince, a paragon of Renaissance ideals, celebrated across Europe for his athleticism and charisma. What alchemy transformed this youthful king into the corpulent tyrant, struggling for breath in the shadows of Whitehall? The answer lies not only in the drama of his marital choices, but in the relentless assault of medical disasters that ravaged his body and warped his mind. By the twilight of January 1547, Henry was a mere echo of the king who had once unhorsed rivals in the tilt yard. His body was a battleground of ailments, his legs marred by ulcerated wounds, emitting a stench so overwhelming that seasoned courtiers fought to suppress their nausea. The king, now an immobile giant, relied on complex machinery to navigate his chambers, his weight estimated to have ballooned towards 400 pounds. His once striking features were lost beneath layers of bloated flesh, his eyes sunken and shadowed in a face tinged with a sickly pallor. The royal physicians, armed with their era's limited knowledge, fought a losing battle, deploying bloodletting, herbal elixirs, and desperate prayers against the onslaught of diseases consuming their king. Modern scholars largely agree that Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and potentially osteomyelitis, a debilitating bone infection responsible for the agonizing pain in his legs. Even more alarming than his physical decline was the deterioration of his mental state. His legendary temper, once a tool of royal authority, now erupted into uncontrollable rages, punctuated by periods of unsettling apathy. Yet as death loomed, the viper's nest of succession consumed the court. Queen Jane Seymour, his third wife, had secured the Tudor line with a male heir, the delicate 9-year-old Edward, but powerful factions were already vying for control of the boy king. The conservative Catholic faction, under the iron fist of the Duke of Norfolk, clashed fiercely with the reformist Protestants, led by Edward Seymour, the young prince's ambitious uncle. Henry, ever paranoid, sensed these power plays, signing death warrants even as his grip on life weakened. The king's plummeting health remained a closely guarded secret, masked by a fade of royal strength. Official pronouncements continued to paint a picture of Henry as robust and vigorous, while the reality unfolding behind palace walls was a stark contrast. Those granted access to the royal chamber were confronted with a harrowing scene. The vast royal bed draped in somber fabrics, the air thick with the cloying odor of decay barely masked by burning incense, and at its center, the immense figure of a man who once symbolized the very essence of England's virility. Palace staff whispered of the king's agonized cries echoing through the stone corridors of Whitehall. The festering ulcers on Henry's legs caused him excruciating pain, with the slightest movement triggering waves of agony. His physicians, desperate for any relief, applied poultices containing a bizarre array of ingredients, from boiled onions to powdered human skull, remedies that only amplified his suffering. More effective, though no less detrimental, was the copious use of opium, which dulled the king's physical pain but further clouded his already fading mind. The psychological torment mirrored the physical. Henry, once the undisputed master of England, held the power of life and death over every subject. Now he found himself a prisoner of his own failing flesh, betrayed by his own body. Court records hint at increasingly erratic behavior marked by moments of near delirium as he raved about the specters of executed rivals or cried out for wives long deceased. In moments of lucidity, the king obsessively scrutinized his will, determined to orchestrate the fate of his dynasty from beyond the grave. Contemporaries noted with alarm the king's wavering stance on religious matters during these final days. Having severed ties with Rome to proclaim himself head of the Church of England, Henry seemed haunted by spiritual doubts. He would demand Catholic rites one day, then fervently reaffirm Protestant tenets the next. His personal chaplain documented the king's terror-stricken awakenings from nightmares, where he claimed to see the accusing faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign standing in silent judgment at the foot of his bed. And the king's impending death ignited a fierce power struggle as courtiers jostled to secure their positions in the shifting political landscape. The Privy Council, once a symbol of royal unity, fractured into competing factions, each scheming to gain advantage in the inevitable regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a survivor of decades of courtly intrigue, found himself outmaneuvered by the ascendant Protestant faction. In a final act of Henry's enduring ruthlessness, Norfolk was condemned to death for treason in the dying king's name, a sentence that would only be avoided due to Henry's own demise before the execution could be carried out. January 27, 1547, marked the beginning of Henry's final descent. Witnesses recounted that the king suffered a violent seizure, requiring attendants to restrain him from injuring himself. As the episode subsided, Henry struggled to speak, his right side partially paralyzed, a clear indication of a massive stroke, according to modern understanding. The court physicians, acutely aware that failure to save the king could cost them their own lives, desperately attempted to revive their patient, applying hot irons to his skin and forcing down bitter medicinal concoctions. Throughout this agonizing ordeal, access to the royal bedchamber remained strictly controlled by Henry's most trusted confidant, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This secrecy served a vital purpose beyond maintaining royal dignity. News of the king's imminent death could unleash a premature scramble for power or even incite foreign intervention. Cranmer ensured that only essential personnel were admitted, and each was sworn to absolute secrecy regarding the monarch's condition. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, was kept at a distance during these critical moments. As January bled into February, the king drifted in and out of consciousness. During brief moments of clarity, Henry reportedly voiced increasing fear regarding his impending judgment before God. The man who had dispatched 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of common subjects now faced his own mortality with growing dread. According to one attendant's personal account, the king was overheard mumbling prayers and begging for forgiveness in his sleep, a striking contrast to the unyielding autocrat who had reshaped England's religious landscape through sheer force. Court records reveal the extraordinary measures taken to preserve Henry's remaining dignity during these final days. As his bodily functions failed, teams of servants worked tirelessly to manage the increasingly unpleasant tasks of cleaning and moving the massive royal body. The ulcers on his legs had deteriorated to such an extent that bone was said to be visible through the decaying tissue. The overpowering stench necessitated the use of perfumed handkerchiefs for anyone entering the royal chamber, and windows were thrown open despite the winter chill whenever the king slipped into unconsciousness. By February 27th, the elaborate charade of a possible recovery could no longer be maintained within the inner circles of the court. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned urgently to the royal bedside. As Henry's breathing became increasingly labored, contemporary accounts detail how the king, unable to speak, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he placed his faith in Christ rather than in the elaborate religious ceremonies he had once championed. Henry reportedly squeezed with what little strength he possessed before succumbing to his final coma, a poignant detail often highlighted by Protestant historians as evidence of a deathbed conversion. The king breathed his last before dawn on January 28, 1547. Even in death, Henry's immense physical presence dominated the royal chamber, his corpse a grotesque testament to excess and suffering. The official cause was simply recorded as natural decay, although modern medical analysis suggests a deadly combination of heart failure, sepsis from infected wounds, and complications arising from probable type 2 diabetes. Yet, more remarkable than the death itself was the extraordinary conspiracy of silence that followed, orchestrated by the Privy Council to suppress the news for 3 critical days while solidifying power around the young Edward VI. This delay proved essential in ensuring a seamless transition of power. While Henry's body lay cooling in his chamber, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new king, moved with calculated precision to seize control. Secret meetings were convened, key fortresses were secured, and potential rivals were neutralized before the public announcement of Henry's death on January 31st. When the bells of London finally tolled to announce the monarch's passing, Edward Seymour had already been named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively ruling England in his nephew's name. The disposal of Henry's remains presented unique challenges, offering a glimpse into Tudor funeral practices and the king's physical state at the time of his death. Court documents confirm that the royal corpse began to decompose with alarming speed, likely accelerated by the advanced infections that plagued him. Embalmers worked feverishly to prepare the body, removing internal organs and filling the cavities with fragrant herbs and preservatives. Even these seasoned professionals were reportedly horrified by the condition of Henry's internal organs, especially his diseased liver and enlarged heart. Henry's coffin had to be custom-built to accommodate his immense girth, reportedly twice the width of a standard noble's casket. The sheer weight necessitated a reinforced bier and additional pallbearers for transport. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses recounted that the lead-lined coffin actually cracked under the pressure from gases building within the decomposing body, causing fluids to leak onto the chapel floor. This gruesome detail was quickly concealed, but reports suggest that dogs licked at the seepage, a final grotesque indignity for a king obsessed with projecting an image of majesty. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th provided the Tudor regime with a final opportunity to showcase Henry's power, even in death. Black draped horses pulled the enormous coffin through streets lined with somber mourners, while elaborate effigies depicted the king as he had appeared in his prime, a stark contrast to the bloated figure he had become. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had provided him with a son and heir, and the only one who had been spared the experience of falling from royal favor, having died of childbirth complications before Henry's affections could wane. The stark reality of Henry's decaying corpse stood in sharp contrast to the carefully cultivated mythology surrounding his reign. Court painters, such as Hans Holbein, had crafted the enduring image of Henry as the broad-shouldered embodiment of masculine power, legs planted firmly, hands on hips, glaring defiantly at the viewer. This meticulously constructed propaganda bore little resemblance to the disease-ravaged body now sealed beneath Windsor's stone floor, yet it would become the definitive representation of Henry VIII in popular imagination for centuries to come. Henry's will served as his final attempt to exert control from beyond the grave. The 36-page document meticulously detailed the line of succession, first to Edward, then to Mary, daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and finally to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. This clear succession, though briefly disrupted by the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, would eventually unfold exactly as Henry had decreed. The king's posthumous influence over England would extend through all three of his children, each of whom would rule as Tudor monarchs before the dynasty ultimately ended with Elizabeth's death in 1603. More immediately significant were the power arrangements Henry established for Edward's minority. The king created a regency council of 16 men designed to govern collectively until Edward reached the age of 18. This balanced approach reflected Henry's deep-seated distrust of any single nobleman wielding excessive power over his son. However, his carefully laid plans were swiftly undermined as Edward Seymour outmaneuvered his fellow counselors to be named Lord Protector within days of Henry's death. The speed with which Henry's wishes were overturned underscored the limitations of even a king's power once death had removed his fearsome presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final days continues to fascinate historians and physicians alike. His symptoms have been retrospectively linked to a variety of ailments, from syphilis to scurvy, although the strongest evidence points to type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. The king's medical records detail increasingly desperate treatments, ranging from the application of live pigeons halved and placed on his festering wounds to experimental concoctions of gold and pulverized precious stones. These costly but ultimately ineffective remedies highlight both the limitations of Tudor medicine and the extraordinary measures undertaken for a patient of Henry's status. Perhaps most poignant were the personal items discovered in the king's chambers after his death. Among the expected symbols of royal authority, jeweled daggers, official seals, and diplomatic correspondence servants discovered a small, locked chest containing more intimate objects: a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to be from his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book, possibly belonging to Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These humanizing details offer a glimpse into the man behind the monstrous reputation, suggesting that even as his body and mind deteriorated, Henry retained some connection to familial bonds and personal sentiment. The king's death triggered immediate political realignments, profoundly shaping England's destiny in the decades to come. Conservative Catholic factions, which had managed to maintain influence during Henry's final years, found themselves abruptly marginalized as Edward Seymour established a decisively Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had administered last rites to the dying king, now accelerated religious reforms that Henry had approached with greater caution. The first English Book of Common Prayer was published just 2 years after Henry's death, pushing England further along the path of Protestant doctrine than the king himself had ever intended. Henry's complex religious stance, having broken with Rome while preserving many Catholic practices, created an ambiguous legacy that allowed both Protestant and Catholic factions to claim him as their own. Protestant reformers emphasized his rejection of papal authority, while Catholics pointed to his defense of transubstantiation and his opposition to Lutheran theology. This theological ambiguity fueled religious conflicts throughout the reigns of all 3 of his children, as England swung between radical Protestantism under Edward, Catholic restoration under Mary, and ultimately the via media established by Elizabeth. The king's death also marked a crucial turning point in Tudor propaganda. Having crafted the image of Henry as England's defender against foreign threats and papal tyranny, royal publicists now faced the daunting task of transferring this authority to a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of young Edward VI deliberately echoed his father's iconic pose, depicting the child with the same wide-legged stance and defiant expression that had characterized Henry's most famous portraits. Court ceremonies emphasized continuity, with courtiers required to bow to Edward's empty throne with the same reverence they had shown to his father. Beyond the political sphere, Henry's death resonated throughout daily life across England. For nearly 4 decades, he had embodied royal authority, his personality and whims directly influencing governance at every level. His passing created both a psychological and political void. Parish records from early 1547 reveal widespread anxiety about the future, marked by increased reports of prophetic dreams, strange celestial omens, and even alleged ghost sightings. For a population steeped in religious symbolism, the death of such a powerful king inevitably carried apocalyptic undertones. International reactions to Henry's death revealed England's complex position on the European stage. The French ambassador conveyed that King Francis thus genuinely mourned his dear brother of England, despite their frequent conflicts. Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, offered a more pragmatic assessment of the strategic implications, wondering whether England under a child king might be vulnerable to invasion or alliance. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry a decade earlier, reportedly offered a mass for the king's soul, a diplomatic gesture acknowledging Henry's significance while reasserting the Catholic claim over his spiritual destiny. The private chambers in Whitehall Palace, where Henry died, soon became imbued with historical significance. Courtiers reported feeling uneasy entering the rooms where the king had suffered his final agonies, with rumors of eerie sounds and inexplicable cold spots fueling superstitious fears. Young Edward VI reportedly refused to sleep in his father's bed, requesting that new chambers be prepared for him. This psychological response underscored the traumatic impact of Henry's death on those who had witnessed his decline, many of whom had dedicated their lives to anticipating and fulfilling his unpredictable demands. Henry's medical case stands as one of history's most extensively documented royal deaths, offering valuable insights into Tudor medical practices. His physicians meticulously recorded the treatments administered during his final months, records that survived because they were preserved as evidence that every possible effort had been made to save the king. These documents reveal a combination of ancient Galenic medicine with emerging Renaissance techniques, hot cupping to draw out bad humors, herbal remedies based on classical texts, and even rudimentary forms of hydrotherapy. The failure of these methods to provide relief underscores the limitations faced by even the most skilled medical practitioners of the time. The king's obsession with his posthumous image extended to explicit instructions for his tomb, a grand monument intended to dwarf all other royal burial sites in England. Henry commissioned elaborate designs featuring 40 life-sized bronze figures and a towering central structure crowned with an equestrian statue of himself. This grandiose plan reflected both his ego and his deep anxiety about how history would judge him. Ironically, the ambitious project remained incomplete due to financial constraints, and the planned bronze figures were eventually melted down during the English Civil War, a fate that would have enraged the image-conscious king. In the immediate aftermath of Henry's death, there was a frenzied scramble to either align with or distance oneself from his legacy. Courtiers who had fallen out of favor during his final years emerged from the shadows, while those who had enjoyed his patronage desperately sought to forge new alliances. Archives are filled with poignant correspondence from royal servants who suddenly found themselves unemployed after decades of service to the king. For many, adaptation proved impossible. The skills needed to navigate Henry's capricious temperament had little relevance in the more restrained court of Edward VI. Some former favorites took their own lives in the months following the king's death, unable to cope with the rapid power shifts. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's death marked the beginning of a pivotal transition in English governance, from a system of rule by an absolute monarch whose personal will dictated policy to a more collaborative form of power sharing between the crown and the nobility. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's intimidating personal authority and relied more heavily on the approval of the council. This shift, although temporarily reversed during Mary's reign, established precedents for limiting royal power, which would further develop under Elizabeth and ultimately contribute to England's unique constitutional evolution. Henry's death, therefore, paradoxically weakened the very institution of absolute monarchy that he had dedicated his life to strengthening. The medical analysis of Henry's final illness has evolved over time, with each generation of physicians reinterpreting his symptoms through the lens of contemporary understanding. Victorian doctors, influenced by moralistic views of disease, often attributed his condition to syphilis, seeing it as divine retribution for his sexual excesses. Specialists in the early 20th century focused more on metabolic disorders, citing gout and diabetes as primary culprits. More recently, medical historians have proposed more complex diagnoses, including McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic condition that could explain both his physical decline and psychological changes, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, resulting from repeated head trauma from jousting accidents in his youth. The disposition of Henry's personal belongings offers a revealing window into Tudor attitudes toward death and remembrance. Court inventories document that objects touched by the king in his final days were treated with exceptional reverence, some preserved almost as relics, despite the official Protestant rejection of such practices. His final set of night clothes, stained with bodily fluids, was ceremonially burned under Cranmer's supervision, an act that combined practical sanitation with symbolic significance. More valuable items, including his vast collection of astronomical instruments and maps, were carefully catalogued before being distributed according to his will or retained for Edward's education. Henry's death placed his surviving wives and children in precarious positions, requiring them to carefully navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. Catherine Parr, his widow, publicly maintained a dignified mourning while privately making rapid arrangements to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour, a union she had postponed during Henry's lifetime. 9-year-old Edward, now king in name but largely controlled by his Seymour uncles, recorded his father's death with chilling detachment in his journal. The emperor's ambassador was commanded to come home on the 4th of January, upon the death of the king, my father, whose soul God pardon. The formal, unemotional entry reflects the limited personal connection between father and son. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters faced their own challenges in the new regime. Mary, at 31, remained a staunch Catholic, increasingly alienated by Edward's Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, only 13, had to tread carefully through court life, her position made vulnerable by her mother's execution and lingering questions surrounding her legitimacy. Both princesses would eventually ascend to the throne Henry had promised them, but their paths would be fraught with peril. Mary narrowly escaping execution during Wyatt's rebellion, and Elizabeth enduring imprisonment in the Tower during her sister's reign. Accounts of Henry's final hours reveal the profound isolation experienced by even the most powerful monarch at the moment of death. Surrounded by physicians, attendants, and courtiers, contemporary records suggest that Henry faced his end in essential solitude, separated from others by his royal status and the uniquely personal nature of death itself. Archbishop Cranmer, attempting to offer spiritual solace, reportedly received little response beyond that final, desperate squeeze of his hand. The king, who had commanded absolute obedience throughout his kingdom, found himself ultimately embarking on that final journey alone, a poignant reminder of mortality's great leveling power. The year following Henry's death revealed the extent to which his personality had shaped English governance. Administrative records reveal a backlog of decisions awaiting his personal attention, many concerning matters that could have been resolved by subordinates but were elevated to the royal level due to a culture of extreme deference. Under Edward's regency government, processes were necessarily restructured to function without the king's direct involvement. This transition, though initially chaotic, ultimately strengthened institutional governance, establishing bureaucratic systems that could operate independently of the monarch's personal attention. Henry's elaborate funeral procession served as his final performance in England's public theater of power. Contemporary accounts describe horses draped in black velvet, heralds bearing ceremonial weapons, and a life-sized wax effigy of the king in full regalia atop his coffin. The artificial body stood in for the decaying natural one concealed beneath. The procession traveled from London to Windsor over several days, allowing thousands of subjects to witness this last display of Tudor grandeur. The careful choreography reflected a deep anxiety about political transition, using ritual to reinforce the message that while the king might die, the monarchy would endure. The court physicians who had failed to save the king faced uncertain prospects in the aftermath. Medical records show that some quickly secured positions with other noble families, while others faced professional ostracism because of their association with Henry's unsuccessful treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had displayed remarkable courage in informing Henry of his impending death when others dared not, leveraged this bravery into continued royal service under Edward VI. The king's apothecaries faced particular scrutiny, with inventories of medicines supplied during Henry's final illness being examined for potential negligence or worse, deliberate hastening of the king's death. The scientific examination of Henry's remains during vault renovations in the 1800s provided tantalizing clues about his physical condition at the time of his death. Workers reported discovering an enormous skeleton consistent with Henry's known height, along with evidence of severe joint deterioration, particularly in the legs. Applying modern forensic techniques to historical medical records suggests that Henry may have reached a staggering weight of approximately 400 pounds at the time of his death, with a waist measurement exceeding 50 inches. This extreme obesity, combined with poor circulation in his legs and the open wounds described in contemporary accounts, would have created the ideal conditions for the sepsis that likely contributed to his demise. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Henry's final days is what they tell us about the limitations of power. The king, who had reshaped England's religious landscape, executed queens and nobles with impunity, and built a navy that would eventually rule the world's oceans, found himself utterly helpless against the deterioration of his own body. Court records describe Henry raging against his physicians, demanding that they restore his health through the sheer force of royal command. This futile defiance against biological reality reveals the central paradox of absolute monarchy, the inevitable vulnerability of even the most powerful human body to disease, decay, and death. The religious ambiguity surrounding Henry's death created an opportunity for competing narratives that served distinct political purposes. Protestant chroniclers highlighted deathbed moments of evangelical clarity, while Catholic writers outside England portrayed a king tormented by regret for his break with Rome. In reality, evidence suggests that Henry maintained his characteristic religious stance until the very end, accepting himself as the supreme head of the English Church while rejecting key Protestant doctrines. This complex theological position, essentially Catholic in ceremony but rejecting papal authority, reflected the king's lifelong inclination to mold institutions around his personal needs rather than conform to external standards. The economic ramifications of Henry's death extended far beyond the confines of the court. Financial records reveal that the new Regency government inherited a severely depleted treasury and debased currency, the consequences of Henry's costly foreign wars and extravagant personal spending. By some estimates, Henry spent the modern equivalent of $200 million on palaces alone during his reign. This financial crisis compelled Edward Seymour to continue Henry's controversial policy of selling monastic lands, accelerating one of the most significant transfers of property ownership in English history. The economic repercussions of Henry's extravagance would contribute to inflation and social unrest throughout his children's reigns. Henry's physical decline served as a potent metaphor for contemporary observers, many of whom viewed the king's body as a symbolic representation of the nation itself. Just as medieval political theory had portrayed the monarch as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers interpreted Henry's decaying flesh as emblematic of a deeper corruption within the realm. Surviving sermons from 1547 reveal preachers drawing explicit parallels between the king's infected legs and the perceived moral decay within English society. This symbolic interpretation gained political traction during Edward's reign, as reformers argued that just as Henry's body had required drastic intervention, so too did England's religious practices require purification. The final days of Henry VIII represent a singular moment where medieval and early modern concepts of kingship converged. On the one hand, the elaborate death rituals, the intense concern with proper burial, and the anxiety surrounding the succession reflected ancient traditions of royal death dating back centuries. On the other hand, the meticulous medical records, the legal precision of Henry's will, and the institutional continuity of government represented more modern approaches to state power. Henry thus died straddling two distinct eras, the last English king to wield truly medieval authority, while also being a monarch who had pioneered the bureaucratic state apparatus that would define future governance. Ultimately, what makes Henry VIII's death so captivating is not only its gruesome physical details or its profound political implications, but also what it reveals about the fundamental aspects of the human condition. The king who had dominated his era through sheer force of personality ended his life confronting the same limitations faced by the humblest of his subjects. Contemporary accounts suggest that Henry experienced moments of profound existential terror in his final days, facing judgment not as a king, but simply as a man. As the Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly reminded him while administering last rites, "You are about to appear where titles hold no weight and earthly power offers no protection." In that final, human vulnerability, England's most infamous king may have achieved a connection with his subjects that had eluded him throughout his reign. So, as we've seen, the death of Henry VIII wasn't just the end of a reign. It was a deeply human story of power stripped bare, of a king facing the ultimate leveler, mortality. From the Golden Prince to the ailing tyrant, Henry's final days reveal the poignant truth that even the most formidable figures are ultimately subject to the frailties of the flesh and the weight of their own choices. His death sparked political upheaval, shaped religious landscapes, and left an indelible mark on English history, a testament to a life lived in extremes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What struck you most about Henry's final days? Do you have any questions or insights to add to the discussion? Please leave a comment below. I'm really interested to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future explorations of fascinating figures and pivotal moments. Thanks for watching.